Well, the title of the book is Peaceable Kingdom Lost, and the phrase Peaceable Kingdom actually comes from William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania in 1682. William Penn was a Quaker and a visionary. He had a utopian ideal of what a society in the New World might be, one where European Christians of all different kinds could live together, but they could also live together in harmony with Native Americans. So that's the Peaceable Kingdom. The story I tell in the book is how the Peaceable Kingdom was lost. In other words, what happened to that utopian vision in the course of the 18th century, running all the way from the foundation of Pennsylvania up to the American Revolution. The idea never really could have worked in practice entirely as William Penn planned it. And the reason for that is that it's founded on a contradiction. William Penn is an idealist, he is a utopian, but there would have been no Pennsylvania if somebody hadn't given him 29 million acres of land to play around with, and that was the King of England, without consultation with the people who live there, who are the Native Americans. So on the one hand, Penn really respects Native American culture. He treats the Indians as belonging to different nations. He makes treaties with them. He purchases their land rather than simply taking it away. But he still claims the land ultimately as his own. He needs to get full and proper title to the land, so he has a sort of a self-interest in doing it by treaty and actual purchase. Then he can sell the land to settlers. So that's William Penn. His sons are less attractive characters, and it's his son Thomas Penn who is the principal governor and owner of Pennsylvania. We have to remember they not only ran the province politically, they owned it. It's a proprietary colony. Thomas Penn reverts from Quakerism to Anglicanism and introduces tactics of fraud and intimidation, such as the walking purchase, something we could talk about, that are more familiar and less noble, I would say, than what William Penn wanted. One of the things I learned most in researching this book was about Native American culture. And I guess I think the most important thing I learned was that there were many different types of Native Americans living in America at that time and living in Pennsylvania. And that's how William Penn himself saw things. He didn't see all Indians as being the same. He recognized that there were separate groups. There were the Delaware Indians, there were the Conestoga Indians, there was the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, which was based up in New York, but had a reach down into Pennsylvania. So he treated all of them as individual groups. They regarded themselves as individual groups. They spoke different languages. So I became very interested in thinking of the Indians that way. Also in realizing that they were major players in history. They weren't just passive victims. Now, the book I've written features an Indian massacre, the massacre of the last 20 Conestoga Indians by the Paxton Boys. That's at the heart of the story. But even they were in constant contact with William Penn, who was their benefactor. Penn made treaties with them. He gave them land to live on. So I was interested in looking at the Indians as players in history, and especially the Iroquois Confederacy, because the Iroquois, that's known also as the Six Nations, they exerted control over all of the smaller Indian groups, including the Delaware Indians and the Conestoga Indians in Pennsylvania. And the Iroquois themselves had what we could call an empire, and they were mediators between the French and English empires that were also vying for control. So they regarded the smaller Indian nations in much of the Northeast as tributary nations. Now, by tributary is meant that the smaller nations had to pay tribute annually to the Iroquois, usually in the form of sending crops or wampum beads, which they used for exchange and ceremonial purposes, to signify that the Iroquois were their lords and masters. The Iroquois denied the tributary nations two basic rights or functions. One was to transact in land, and the other was to make war. They could not do either of those things without the permission of the Iroquois. Furthermore, the Iroquois reduced the Delaware Indians to the status of women. They said, you are women, you cannot make war, you cannot buy land, you can do what women do, but you cannot engage in other activities without referring to us. So what we get is a complex situation in which there are quite powerful Indians, there are Indians with less power, but all of them are interacting and engaging and acting, and the book brings them to life in a way that they appear as something other than simply passive victims. They are victims in the end of forces more powerful, but boy, do they fight and resist along the way. Well, in the story I tell of the Peaceable Kingdom Lost, the book covers a century from the foundation of the colony by William Penn up to the American Revolution. And the turning point is the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is the final climactic moment in an ongoing struggle for imperial mastery between the French and the English, who will control North America. Now, we call it the French and Indian War because a lot of the Native Americans sided with the French as the lesser of two evils and decided to fight against the English in that war. What happens during the French and Indian War is that Delaware Indians who have been expelled from Pennsylvania and pushed out of Pennsylvania across the Susquehanna River side with the French, and they launch attacks on Pennsylvania. So war finally comes to Pennsylvania. Now I say finally because Pennsylvania was founded as the Peaceable Kingdom. It's a Quaker colony. It does not even have a militia when the war breaks out. It has no means of defending itself. And you could say the Peaceable Kingdom comes to an end during the French and Indian War in the 1750s when Pennsylvania goes to war against the Indians. So the Indians are attacking Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania responds by declaring war for the first time in its history. And it declares war on the Delaware and Shawnee Indians who are attacking it. The declaration of war includes scalp bounties, so that Western settlers who bring in the scalp of a dead Indian will be rewarded. Now, the easiest Indian to kill is one who happens to be nearby. It doesn't much matter if they're an enemy or not. You'll get your scalp bounty. The people who are defending Pennsylvania on the frontier, and the frontier in those days doesn't go further west than Lancaster and Harrisburg. People who are defending the frontier, we refer to these days as the Scots-Irish. These are settlers who have come from the northern Irish province of Ulster. They're of Scottish origin. They arrive in Pennsylvania. They don't stay in Philadelphia. They move out to the west. They set up as squatters. They defy the Penn family. They defy the Indians. They just take whatever land they can get and they set up as squatters and they claim title. Actually, their way of claiming title to land is called tomahawk right. They'll take a hatchet and they'll carve their initials in a tree. And that's theirs. That land is theirs. Now, when the Indians attack, they are the first line of defense, and really the only line of defense before a militia is formed. So they become Indian fighters. They've already settled on Indian land. Now the Indians are attacking them. They're fighting Indians. The conditions on the frontier are pretty gruesome. The people on the frontier are increasingly angry that not enough is being done in Philadelphia to defend them. The assembly in Philadelphia is still a Quaker body. They're saying, we're doing all the fighting, but nobody's helping us. They're not sending soldiers, they're not sending money. It's out of those frustrations, ultimately, that the Paxton Boys emerge. Now, the Paxton Boys were a group of these angry and embittered Scots-Irish frontier settlers who had moved out west in the course of the 18th century. They had found themselves defending the frontier during the French and Indian War. The same thing happens in 1763, which is a key turning point in the book and in American history. In 1763, the largest Indian uprising in American history up to that point takes place, and that's Pontiac's War. Pontiac leads a rebellion way up in the Great Lakes region that spreads all the way down to Pennsylvania. So what happens in 1763, the same thing that had been happening in the French and Indian War just a few years earlier. Indians are attacking. The province doesn't have a militia. It's disbanded its militia. Who's defending the province? It's the frontiersmen. So they are angry and they demand that a militia be formed. And the government, the provincial government in Philadelphia says, okay, go ahead, set up 2 companies of 50 men each. And they will be commanded by the Reverend John Elder of Paxton Presbyterian Church, known as the Fighting Parson of Paxton Presbyterian Church. So he goes ahead and he organizes 2 militia companies of 50 men each for strictly defensive purposes. That's his mandate. But they quickly exceed their mandate and they go on the offensive. And they go out looking for Indians to kill. And they go for the local Indians. Many of them are Christian Indians living in missions founded by the Moravians. And for complicated reasons, they don't succeed in those expeditions. And so what they do is they turn their attention on a small enclave of only 20 remaining Indians. These are the Conestoga Indians, who've been living on the same land that was donated to their forefathers by William Penn 3 generations earlier. And on 2 separate massacres in December 1763, they exterminate those 20 Indians, including 8 children. The first on the little farm where they live, they kill 6 of them. The remaining 14 are put in the Lancaster jail and workhouse for their safety. 2 weeks later, the Paxton Boys ride into town, led by the same men who lead the militia that's just been formed. It's the same people. They ride into town, they break open Lancaster jail and workhouse in broad daylight, noon on a Sunday, in full visibility. They quickly dispatch the Indians. And what they're doing is they're transmitting a message to everybody who will listen. And this is a very, very shocking event in American colonial history. And that message is there is no such thing as a friendly Indian. The distinction between friendly Indian, enemy Indian is false. There's only one type of Indian. All Indians are enemies. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. Now that phrase, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, they don't use exactly that phrase. That's a 19th century phrase. That's familiar to us because this sort of thing happens on the American frontier throughout the 19th century. It matters so much in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania had once been the Peaceable Kingdom, and now the Peaceable Kingdom is utterly lost. And so 1763 is a key year. It's also a turning point in American history generally. It's the year when we say this is when the Revolutionary era begins. And that actually happens in Pennsylvania too, in a particular way. Well, after they massacred the Conestoga Indians in December 1763, what the Paxton Boys actually did was something extraordinary. They marched on the city of Philadelphia. So rumors begin to circulate in the city that several thousand frontiersmen are marching on the city, and they will destroy the city if their grievances are not met. In the end, about 300 Paxton Boys do march across the frozen countryside. It's February 1763. They get as far as Germantown, which is 6 miles outside the city. And there they are met by a delegation led by Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin persuades them to write down their grievances. So they write down their grievances in 2 documents that we have, a demonstration, a remonstrance and a declaration, the documents are called. Instead of a war of weapons, what ensues is a war of words, an extraordinary pamphlet war. There are actually 63 pamphlets published and 10 political cartoons where the Presbyterians and the Anglicans and the Quakers all go at each other trying to find out who's responsible. But as far as responsibility is concerned, the most important thing about the Paxton Boys is that they are never interrogated, arrested, or prosecuted. So what happens to the Paxton Boys for what they did in December 1763? Nothing. They escape scot-free. And that leads to open season on Indians in Pennsylvania. That's a very clear message again. It's carte blanche for like-minded frontier settlers that if they attack Indians in this way, they can get away with it. And so what happens in western Pennsylvania as the frontier slowly moves west, you have wave after wave of settlers coming, crossing the Susquehanna River, moving out into the Ohio Valley in the 1760s. It becomes very violent, very unstable, and the chief losers in this are the Native American inhabitants of the region, and all of this is a prelude then to what happens during the American Revolution. In American history, we often take the year 1763 as a turning point, and it is a turning point. And usually what we mean by that is that the Peace of Paris is signed, which is the end of the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War was the American component of a larger war called the 7 Years' War. So what has happened is the English have acquired a huge empire from the French. They're utterly victorious in the French and Indian War. They defeat the French and their allies, and they acquire a huge empire stretching from Florida to Quebec. Within 15 years, they've lost it all because the American Revolution comes. So usually when we look at the origins of the Revolution, we start in 1763. A proclamation is made whereby Western settlers are not supposed to go beyond a certain line. They're very angry about that. Meanwhile, on the eastern seaboard, we have the Stamp Act crisis, we have the Boston Tea Party, we have Lexington and Concord. So what I'm giving you there is the familiar narrative of the origins of the American Revolution, the one we all know. There's a less familiar narrative in the West, and we can trace it through the Paxton Boys, and that's the connection between the Paxton Boys and the Revolution. 1763 is also a turning point. It's the year of the Conestoga Massacre. The Paxton Boys go unpunished. The result is chaos on the west. Settlers ignore the proclamation line, keep pushing west. Indians are more and more squeezed. The Paxton Boys themselves disappear from view. Then they resurface a couple of years after the massacre, and they actually occupy the land that the Conestoga Indians had lived on. And they say, this is ours by right of conquest. And they're driven off, they're driven away. But that phrase, by right of conquest, becomes very important in the Revolution. The Paxton Boys re-emerge at the end of the 1760s in an extraordinary episode whereby the colony of Connecticut is seeking to make a plantation in northern Pennsylvania. Now, how could they be doing that? Well, Connecticut says, we have a colonial charter here. The king gave us a charter in the 17th century, but it has no western boundary. It's a sea-to-sea charter. It goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Nobody ever said it didn't, so we're just going to expand westward. Now, immediately in our way is part of New York, so let's leapfrog New York and we'll set up in Pennsylvania. Why not? Lots of people are doing this. The Ohio Company is founded in Virginia for the same purpose, to try and get land out west. So Connecticut is doing that. The Connecticut speculators hired the Paxton Boys as mercenaries to fight for Connecticut against Pennsylvania. Don't forget, the Paxton Boys hate the Pennsylvania government. And so when the Revolution comes, it's this extraordinary situation of Connecticut Yankees against Pennsylvania Tories. That's what the Revolution is about. Thomas Penn and his family, the government of Pennsylvania, they're the Tories, the bad guys. The good guys are the Patriots, the Yankees. But who's right in there in the thick of the Patriots? The Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys die in a massacre when an army of loyalists and Indians invade northern Pennsylvania. Paxton Boys go out to fight them. They're slaughtered. But they die just as they had lived, fighting Indians and Tories over land. Now, the second part of the American Revolution that's very important here is that overall the Revolution was a disaster for Native Americans. When war came, Native Americans had to choose once again. They had chosen during the French and Indian War. They chose the French as the lesser of two evils. There weren't all that many French people in North America. There were lots and lots of British, so they chose the French. When the Revolutionary War came in the 1770s, Americans said, well, look at all these American settlers who are sweeping across our land. At least the British are drawing boundary lines. So they sided with the British. 4 of the 6 Iroquois nations fought on the British side. They lost. And so in 1783, the end of the Revolutionary War, the second Peace of Paris, all of their land is taken away by right of conquest. And during the war, American Patriot forces launch scorched earth campaigns against the Iroquois and massacre Indians out in the Ohio Valley on a colossal scale. So in a quite disturbing sense, all of this is the Paxton Boys writ large. It's right by conquest as national policy rather than as a local massacre. In telling the story of a century of time, and way back in colonial America, we wondered what sort of relevance does it have for the present, for our understanding, say, of the United States today. Making Native Americans actors in their own history was very important in the book. And one of the things it made me wonder about is, well, what would Native Americans think of a book like this today? And what is the place of Native Americans in our society today? Where do they fit in our society today? And so I did a little thinking and a little research about this even after the book was published, just for some publicity stuff I was doing and some op-eds I was writing. And I discovered, for instance, at the time this story begins, say 1700, our best estimate is that there were about 5,000 Native Americans living in Pennsylvania. There had been many more than that, many more, but 5,000 survived. So I wondered how many live in Pennsylvania today. And it's easy to find out. It's actually in the census, because the census now asks you to choose a primary identification or ethnicity. And what I found was that there are 20,000. Now, they come from something like 16 different tribes and nations, so some of them have moved into Pennsylvania, but it's still 4 times the number. So there are some. Nonetheless, Pennsylvania is one of only 6 states where no tribe has recognition from the state or the federal government, and it's one of only 12 states that has no reservation. So nobody knows there are Indians in Pennsylvania. In fact, what happened in the revolution in the 18th century and after was so extreme that most people believed in the 19th century and the 20th century that there were no Native Americans in Pennsylvania. But that's actually an extreme form of the myth of the vanishing Indian. What I've heard from Native Americans in response to this book, I haven't heard from many, but what I have heard is thank you, in the sense that we want people to know that some of us did survive and that we're still here. Now, when I say that there's no reservation in Pennsylvania, I'm not saying that I think there should be one, or that Native Americans would necessarily want there to be one, because Native Americans live in all 68 counties in Pennsylvania, and they live in they work in many different walks of life. But just recognition, I think, that there is a Native American history east of the Mississippi, and that some Native Americans still survive. The other thing that's interesting about this is that the federal government recognizes today 560 Indian nations or tribes that have their own sovereignty. And it's a very interesting situation in which they live, because they are outside of state law. They're ultimately under federal law, but they're existing somewhere between or beyond. Usually we think of just federal law and state law, but there are Americans, Native Americans, who live as recognized sovereign entities who have rights and privileges based on that recognition. Nearly all of them are west of the Mississippi. To get federal recognition as a Native American tribe or nation, you typically need to be able to demonstrate 2 things. One is unbroken continuity as a people over a long period of time, and 2 is unbroken attachment to some land, or at least a claim to some land. You can't do that in Pennsylvania because of what happened in Pennsylvania. So it's really quite significant that way. And I would say, if you studying Pennsylvania in particular, if we go back into the 18th century, what happened in Pennsylvania had happened elsewhere earlier. It happened here in Massachusetts. The Puritans fought wars of extermination against the Pequot Indians as early as the 1630s. It didn't happen until much later in Pennsylvania, and for two reasons. One is Pennsylvania was set up a little bit later, not until the 1680s, but the other is the Quaker heritage. And what really matters about Pennsylvania is that Pennsylvania is the gateway to the West, and hence to the future. And so what unfolded in Pennsylvania will happen, unfortunately, time and time again as westward movement in the new United States progresses all across the continent in the 19th century. As far as sources are concerned, the book is based heavily, almost exclusively, on 18th century primary source material. What I mean by that is I started with the sources, not with the secondary literature. And by training a historian of the 19th century, I moved back into the 18th century, and I said, I want to do this book because I want to do it. I'm not doing it because I need a promotion. I'm not doing it because an editor asked me to write it. I'm doing it because there's a story here that's worth telling and that I want to tell in a particular kind of way. And so I had the luxury to be able to start with the primary sources and work my way out and just try and figure out what people were saying, what motivated them on their own words. A lot of the sources, the manuscript and archival sources, are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. That includes personal papers from a lot of the major players, including William Penn and the Penn family. The American Philosophical Society has similar sets of papers, including some by Benjamin Franklin. Local historical societies out in the Lancaster and Harrisburg region from lesser-known figures. Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, used extensively because of the Ulster antecedents of these groups. And then a large body of printed primary source material, by which I mean material that was printed at the time. These include the records of the legislative and executive branches of the colonial government, a multi-volume set, all of the pamphlets. There were about 63, 64 pamphlets exchanged. Much of that printed primary material I was able to get at the O'Neill Library here at Boston College. One online resource that was especially useful to me was the digitized Evans collection from the Antiquarian Society in Worcester. Otherwise, I would have been going out to Worcester all the time, and instead I was able to pull down. The Evans collection, I think, contains something like 3/4 of all 18th century printed material, so that was a gold mine. And then secondary material, but I started sort of resolutely from the inside out and with the primary sources this time. One of the things I like to do as a historian always is to write in a way that as many people as possible can read what I write. In fact, I'd find it very, very depressing if I spent 7 years on a book, which I did, and only a handful of people could read it because of the way it was written. So with much of my previous work, I've tried to accomplish that goal, and basically, in a couple of ways. One is always to write with an implied reader in mind. So not to be just writing for the sake of writing, or not writing in a vacuum, but always with an implied reader. Now, who is the implied reader for this book? The implied reader is anybody with sufficient interest in history that if they had the time, they would pick up that book in a bookstore. They'd pick it up and say, that looks like an interesting story. I'd like to read that. Now, we don't all have as much time to read as we can, but that's who I'm trying to reach. So anybody who would read history, serious history, I suppose you could call it, but who would read history for pleasure when they have time to read. Now, it's fine to have that goal, and it requires a particular type of writing, and I can talk more about that. But it's not enough just to have the goal. You also have to have an outlet. So you could write that way, and still nobody would read it unless you had the right publisher. So I have a very good working relationship with my editor at Oxford University Press, Susan Ferber, who I worked with on an earlier book that was packaged more academically, but still managed to get a readership. And so I sat down with my editor and I said, this is what I'd like to do with this book. I don't want to spend lots and lots of all this time and energy and have nobody read it. What can we do to at least give the book a fighting chance? And so Susan oversees the trade list in history at Oxford, at the press I worked with, and so it went out through that outlet. And you know, it's a matter of a number of things. The book has 32 illustrations and 6 maps. It has, to the extent that you can judge a book by its cover, it's doing pretty well because it has a nice cover. It's a very handsome design. It has an elegant font and all of that, but it's also priced accordingly. It wasn't priced out of the market. I know that some books can come in at $60. This book is a hardback that you can buy when it comes out. You can get it at a 40% discount if you buy it online. And I'm not, you know, the price is very manageable. So what I've learned is that a book can succeed on its own. The chances of it rising and succeeding all the way on its own are slim because there are decisions taken at press level in business conferences about marketing long before you've written a word sometimes, or if you've only written a proposal, that really do determine which way the book is going. It's only when you have some degree of seniority that you can get involved in those conversations. So assuming my goal was to have a readership for the book and that I'm fortunate enough in having an outlet that will at least not prevent that from happening, let's put it that way, then how do I do it? Well, anything I publish, and what I've published here, went through 6, 7, 8 drafts, that's for sure. As I always find, if you're in the presence of reasonably fluent, elegant writing, the chances of that having come from the author's pen, so to speak, fully formed, are about 0. That's the product of just very hard work, caring, but also knowing who it is you're trying to write for. Now, as a general proposition, I like to tell stories when I write history. I think that stories are very important. I think that that's what draws the reader in. I like books that explain change over time, so that something was one way at the beginning and another way at the end. There was a peaceable kingdom, the peaceable kingdom was lost. So I like to try to explain change over time. I'm also looking in a lot of the history I write for a dramatic episode that I can somehow hang a narrative on or arrange a narrative around. In this case, we have the tragic massacre of the Conestoga Indians. That's the fulcrum of the book. It occurs about 2/3 of the way through the book. The book starts in 1680, the massacre is in 1763. But a lot of the action is rising towards that point. So there are also elementary novelistic techniques that historians can use, or at least plotting techniques. The book has 2 plot points. The first plot point is the Conestoga Massacre. The second plot point is the Revolution. The action rises to the first plot point, it falls, and then it rises to the second plot point. The book has characters who we follow through time. Among them are William Penn, Benjamin Franklin, and the occasional unfortunate cameo appearance by George Washington, who doesn't come out all that well out of this story, but also characters you haven't heard of, but that you get to know. Some Indian leaders, some leaders of the Paxton Boys. So there are elements of character, storytelling, and plotting. The book also has a main plot and a subplot, because the Paxton Boys, I often wondered, how would I be able to connect the Paxton Boys to the Revolution? And I knew I could do it in the abstract. I could say, well, 1763 was right by conquest on a local level. the revolution was right by conquest on a macro level. And that's fine. And that's a very academic way of doing it. But I actually was able to trace the Paxton Boys themselves as individuals, as humans in history, from one event to the other. And that was how I accomplished it. So it's very much that the analysis is embedded in the storytelling, if you can do it that way. And when I say the book has a subplot as well as a plot, what allows the Paxton Boys to become involved in the revolution at all is their involvement with this strange episode when Connecticut tries to plant a colony in northern Pennsylvania. Well, I laid the groundwork for that in the book much, much earlier. And I allude to that strange development several times without the reader really knowing. The reader must say, well, why is he telling us this? But it's all leading to the Paxton Boys and the revolution converging. So really, you have a subplot, you have a plot, and then they come together at the very end. So that's what I like to do, and that would constitute some degree of good writing, at least for me, satisfying writing. The most satisfying thing of all in a book for me is writing it, because I can't read it once it's written. What can I do with the book now? I can take great pleasure in giving it to friends and colleagues. I can have a book launch, but I can't read it. If I pick it up, I read the first 3 words of a sentence, I'm already at the bottom of the paragraph. I've been over it so many times. I would need a glass of good red wine to get to the end of a paragraph and a glass of whiskey to get to the end of a page. So the pleasure for me has to be in the doing. And it's a 7-year product. And part of the great pleasure for me is in the writing and setting myself that goal.